Hi, welcome to Smart City Institute to Japan's webinar series called Global Perspective on the Smart Cities. I'm Tak Nagumo, Executive Director of Smart City Institute Japan, your host today. Today, we have two distinct speakers, and we'll talk about the topic of could the lessons of digital transformation in the enterprise be applied to the design of smart city project and vice versa. And let's invite our distinct speakers today. We have two speakers. First speaker, Ms. Sinead Kaiya from Global CEO, Woven Planet. Hi, Sinead.
Hi there, great to see you.
Hi, thank you for joining me. Second speaker, Paul Beddie, International Ambassador, SAP Labs Japan. Hi, Paul.
Hi, Tak, great to see you again.
Hi, thank you for joining me. So today we're going to have a very conversational webinar today. We're not really presenting any materials, but casually discuss what we could apply lessons learned in the enterprise world to the smart cities. And for the audiences, we encourage you to write questions, comments to the speakers through chat. And then when you write something, please choose all panelists and participants from the pull down button, so we can share all the writings with all the participants today. All right, so let's begin our conversation. So Sinead, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you very much for having me. My name is Sinead Kaiya, and I'm the Global COO of Woven Planet. I think Woven Planet is a name which is gathering more and more attention here, especially in Japan. It was set up specifically as the software arm for Toyota, focused on the future of mobility and includes exciting projects like the Woven City, as well as everything around autonomous driving. I recently joined Woven Planet in July. Previous to that, I had a nearly 20 years career at SAP. I worked across 5 different countries in many different departments. Some of my key roles were Chief of Staff to the CEO, where I was responsible for strategic and corporate governance topics for nearly 4 years. And I was also the COO of R&D for SAP globally, so looking after their overall R&D investment portfolio. And just before I left SAP, I was working in Japan for 2 years, supporting Japanese customers and customers across Asia with innovation projects. So thank you very much for having me.
Paul, could you introduce yourself?
Sure, and thanks again for having me today. Paul Beddie from SAP. I have relatively recently joined SAP in a newly formed role called International Ambassador. This is a role that the organization has set up to work with Japan headquartered companies, usually the biggest companies that are household names, and work with the executives of those companies and the board members and help those organizations further their globalization initiatives using the entirety of the SAP ecosystem that's at our disposal and worldwide. So it's a very interesting role. As many people may think of SAP, you think of us primarily as the ERP vendor. And indeed, we are probably the world's largest ERP solutions provider. But we do a lot of other things as well. We have over 1,200 products in the portfolio. And we do a lot of things around future cities. We're starting to do a lot of things around sustainability. Obviously, because of that, we're also heavily involved and I think in Sinead's previous life, she was also heavily involved in things like a lot of the AI solutions and blockchain and IoT and things like that. So we're actually a lot more than just ERP. My career has actually, I've actually been in Asia for nearly 30 years, originally from the US. I came to Japan initially in 1991 and then started working with Chiyoda Kako Kensetsu, the Chiyoda EPC, Engineering Procurement Construction Company. Early in my career, I was involved in the environmental movement in the early 90s, selling scrubbers to big coal-fired power plants all over the world, and also got into a bit of what would eventually become smart cities. Down in Adelaide, Australia, we were working on a project, the Multipolis project in Adelaide that they were trying to put together in the early 90s. It never really took off, but that was kind of my first taste of it. After a number of years with Chiyoda, I moved into the world of management consulting, initially with Deloitte, and joined their energy practice in Australia, and became a bit of a project management specialist and got into understanding how IT helps companies modernize, became very much of a CRM, customer relationship management proponent, doing a lot of strategy work, but also helping clients with that transformation of their sales and customer facing processes. Eventually came back to Japan and ran a practice here for E&Y, doing CRM, and then eventually moved into a smaller boutique consulting firm and got into a lot of business transformation projects, particularly in the financial services space. And then eventually got acquired by a large US BPO company, business process outsourcing company called Genpact, which was a spin out from GE. And they actually moved me to China at the end of 2011. And so I've kind of just returned to Japan, having spent the last 9 years in China. And in 2015, I stepped away from corporate world and started my own business around smart building solutions, getting into smart cities, getting into autonomous vehicles, electric vehicles, really kind of reintegrated myself back into the world of sustainability, energy efficiency. And so have had a lot of experience in the last several years in China in particular, working with the intersection of smart cities, smart mobility, and sustainability. And now that I've come across back to the world of IT with SAP, and even though my mandate is to be this international ambassador guy, I have a very strong personal passion for smart cities and sustainability. So everybody I talk to, I kind of somehow managed to figure out how to get those two topics into the conversation.
I can attest to that.
All right, thank you very much. So it looks like collectively we cover most of the world continent. And let's not talk about something specific about the specific corporation. Rather, let's talk about what we learned, you know, at the high level from the enterprise world, and think about the applicability to the smart city, which is the mixture of public and private, and even people, right? And it's a new challenge across the world, Europe, Asia, Japan, US, interesting topic, right? So the first question I would like to ask you is what lesson learned from the corporate world can be applied to smart cities? Sinead, what do you think?
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember we came up with this topic after a discussion we had on another event, where I was listening to all the discussions about smart cities and thinking, this is so similar to digital transformation within corporations in so many ways, right? Like cities are obviously physical entities, but you take some of these complex enterprises, they're just as spread out and diverse and in many ways siloed and in need of integration that a city is. So just in listening to you speak, you know, about the Smart City Institute and some of the theories around smart cities, I thought perhaps this is a topic we could, you know, really explore and share some of our learnings on, at least where we've seen customers be very, very successful from digital transformation perspective. I started with the board of SAP back in 2010, and one of the things I remember was at that time, the CEOs were largely invited to speak to the CIO of a company, right? The IT officer. It was almost impossible for SAP CEOs to talk to anybody except the head of IT. And of course, if it was a very expensive project, then maybe the CFO, potentially the CEO. I remember this distinct change back in the kind of 2010, 2015 time, when they started getting invited into the boardroom. And not just the CEO boardroom, but like the chairman, like the board of directors room, right? And here's when you realize the topic of digital transformation was starting to move up within companies and not become an IT topic, but it started to be seen as a strategic business necessity topic, right? Since then, obviously, the word digital transformation or DX has become almost a common language within the business world. And roles like the chief digital officer, which didn't exist back in the early 2000s, have now become quite common. Right? So it's been this real rise of the importance of digital transformation within the corporate world. And I think as I was listening to you speak about smart cities, I assume probably the same has been happening within the public sector and within discussions within cities. I used to live in New York, and I remember meeting the CTO of New York City. And I thought, oh, wow, okay, here we go. Like it's, the same sort of transformation is starting to happen. So I think one of the things to reflect on just from a smart city perspective is what sort of cultural shift is happening and where is digital transformation being placed in terms of priority? Because in the corporate world, it's now priority number one, like up at the top of many sort of studies of chairman CEO priorities. So I think that's one thing it's interesting for the smart city community to reflect on is sort of where is it placed from that strategic point of view. And when you're going into a smart city discussion, are you talking to people who are the ones who are sort of doing the implementation? Are you really talking with the very senior city leaders and the people who are setting the direction? That will tell you a lot in terms of where the maturity is compared to corporate enterprise. But those are just some first reflections from my side from a big picture view. But maybe Paul, also over to you for some of your broader thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, kind of on that same vein of thought, as you're trying to, promote transformational projects, you definitely want to go as high up in the organization from a corporate perspective as you possibly can. If you can get to the CEO or the COO and have them as the champion of what you're trying to do, then the technology can follow in behind. And that tends to set the stage for what will be eventually a much more successful implementation of change. And that's ultimately what you're using the digital environments for. I think when you similarly, as Sinead indicated, when you're talking to cities, if you're talking to the chief technology officer of a city, you may get caught up in the fact that he's more thinking about technology than he is thinking about what are the citizen services, what are the impacts to the people in the city that really need to be thought about in order for that technology to get adopted by people. And so, just like in a corporate world, if all you talk about is the technology, you generally will not have a successful project. If you're doing a transformation, you really have to think about, how do you bring the people along with you? What is the organizational change management? What are some of the characteristics that you need to look at in terms of human behaviors and in the cultural aspects of how do you drive change? And technology is ultimately nothing more than just an enabler of that change. So from a smart city perspective, I think one of the challenges that a lot of, it's almost becoming a bad word in some circles, smart cities, like, oh no, not another technology vendor. It's not about the technology. It has to be about the people, and you have to keep things people-centric. Otherwise, you end up with just a lot of technology for technology's sake. And that's the same in the corporate world. If you don't have a good business case, if you don't have an understanding as to how it's going to make people's jobs easier, how it's going to make their lives easier, you're going to have a tremendous difficulty getting the buy-in of people to actually then use the technology at the end of the project. So I think smart cities are a similar situation where sometimes there's things out there that have been done for technology's sake and not really thinking through, well, how are people going to actually use this? What benefit are they going to get out of it?
Thank you very much.
There was one question I did want to ask both of you from your experience in smart cities, because with digital transformation, having that very senior sponsorship from a chairman, from a CEO, is what gives the digital transformation its energy and its vision. What is the equivalent in a city transformation?
Good question. So, what's being said in the global scale is that the 70% of the population will be living in the cities. So urbanization is mounting the social issues, and manpower is not enough to solve that. So why don't you use the technology to solve the social issues? right?
Right.
That's the kind of, first year, mandate. And in the case of Japan, aging and depopulation is the most important reason. So if you look at the Japanese population curve, it's sharply declining, right? So by 2100, year 2100, right, the population will be half of today, right? So the social security is needed, the social infrastructure is old and eroded, and we need manpower for driver, taxi driver, bus driver, and then who can support elderly, who cannot do things by themselves, right? So digital technology is only means to achieve the welfare, well-being of our population. That's why we are rushing into the smart cities right now, right? And then the national government started to implement the idea first as a kind of top-down approach, but we recognize that it's not really sufficient unless people on the ground buy in the idea and participate in the process. So the mandate is now more strongly given to the mayors of the cities, the municipalities. They are the guy who are selected from the direct voting. In Japan, if you look at the national parliament, we first choose the congressman, right? Parliament politicians. As they form the majority political party, and the head of the national, primary party is the choosing the prime minister. So it's a second step to choose that national leader, right? But when it comes to the cities, municipalities, we can choose the mayor directly. So they are more on authority to decide, more power to convince people in terms of what direction the city should be heading to. So they are, expected leaders to drive the city for smart cities.
So then it's very similar to CEOs. Sorry, Paul. I was going to say it's very similar to CEOs in that a lot of CEOs didn't have to think about technology. A decade ago, they had a CIO to worry about it. But now they need to be very fluent and in digital transformation, just like I assume that a lot of city leaders have had to make this transition as well. But Paul, maybe you've seen similar situation.
I was going to say it's similar. The mayors of cities are really where I think the rubber hits the road, as it were, for smart cities. And particularly, having spent near the last 10 years in China, it's really interesting in China, the mayors of Beijing, the mayor of Shanghai, the mayor of Guangzhou, those are actually next to the premier and the president of the country. Those are the most powerful people in the country because they control everything that's going on in that, in Shanghai or in Beijing, which are the huge economic centers. And they have the ability to make things happen within the city. And it's at city level, I think, where smart cities are actually they happen. And I don't think you can mandate smart cities at a federal level. I think there's too many unique points about the different locations, and having to understand the idea of think global, act local. Within a city, you have to actually go down to the district level, I think, and start finding out where the grassroots, and do a bottom up and a top down approach to have a successful smart city program. The top down will generally think about, well, it's technology, and the bottom up people are going to say, well, hang on a minute, where do the people come into this? And that's usually where you find the mixture start happening.
Right. Yeah, I was thinking it could be a clever strategy for some mayors in Japan to speak with corporate leaders who are leading digital transformation and exchange experiences and best practices. I don't know if they look to DX corporate leaders for advice or support, just from an approach to digital transformation.
It's a great point. You know what? I'm coming from the global banking background, right? And we did a lot of digital transformation, data orientation, particularly banking is a regulated industry where you have to calculate the risk amount to come up with the required capital level, right? So we really have the data concerning the credit risk, market risk, operation risk, right? So to collect the data of that kind, you really have to digitalize the processes.
Yeah.
And standardize the data format, so that we can aggregate and calculate the necessary capital, right? So within the bank, we are so much, focused on the digital transformation, but it's not known from outside.
Yeah, I think so.
Right. So probably from the perspective of the mayors, they don't know who they should talk to.
Yeah, right.
In general, of course, they know, oh, let's talk to Yahoo, let's talk to IBM, let's talk to SAP. But by name, they don't know who to speak to.
Yeah.
That's quite funny because, when I was working in the banking and the financial services sector as a consultant, I often had the sense that, the banks, a lot of people, particularly the IT departments in the banks, forget that they're actually banks. They think they're actually IT companies.
Yeah, you're right.
Banks are, especially the tier 1 large global banks, are great at building their own bespoke solutions and trying not to use other people's software and end up with huge armies of IT people, and cities obviously don't have that luxury of having those type of resources at their disposal. But it's, it would be an interesting conversation for them to talk about, how do banks go through big transformations? Because it's all about technology in a bank. That's all the banks are now, really, are technology centers.
Right. So all the, digital or data related languages I heard in the bank back in 2010 to 2015. It was like a data catalog,
Data lakes and
data lakes. Those are now getting common in public sector.
Right.
Right. So there's some slight time lag between the sectors.
Yeah, it was interesting because I was also thinking about what are the success factors of digital transformation in the corporate world. And one of them, like I touched on, is having that very strong senior level vision and communication of where the organization is trying to go. And something which is far beyond technology, but which is about increasing the agility of the organization, better serving your customers, getting the company ready for the next 50 years. So someone who has that sort of long-term vision and commitment and planning. One of the other keys to digital transformation success in the corporate world is high caliber talent and getting people who have digital skills. And I think one of the other areas where the corporate world and the public sector could partner much better is by sharing talent. I'm very, aware of the fact that I think the software industry unfairly dominates the talent market in many ways. It's a very high margin business compared to others, and can afford to pay, certain levels of compensation and, provide a certain flexible lifestyle and et cetera. On the other hand, you see that in a way, the IT industry therefore starves other important areas like the public sector that desperately need digital skills. But on the other hand, we also have a lot of people in the private software sector who want to contribute to the betterment of society. So is there a way you could do internships or exchanges and start sort of trying to get this talent flow going back and forth? Because it's really hard to drive a digital transformation if you don't have incredibly high caliber talent from a business planning, business process planning, and also technical perspective.
Yeah, it's a great point. Yeah, particularly in Japan, 70% of the digital transformation or ICT experts are populated in IT vendors.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right.
The least populated areas are public sector and educational sector. And then all of the high margin business are centralized in big cities. So even though the Japanese government wants to distribute the location of the smart cities in 100 different locations in Japan, how can you, allocate the digital experts to those local area is a good challenge, actually.
Right.
Yeah. And raising up digital talents in each location is not really feasible. So, like you mentioned, probably partnering between public sector and the private sector to foster the data capabilities in smart cities and locations will be the best course of actions we can take in the future.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I think companies like SAP in Japan, even though our DNA is from Germany, I think we actually have a lot of people that we do share resources with on kind of a volunteer basis with some of the cities in Japan through our kind of CSR initiatives, through our kind of our purpose initiatives, where we do have people working with some of those cities. Obviously, there's not lots of them going, but it's definitely after you reach a certain, particularly after you reach a certain age, or a certain amount of wealth accumulation, people definitely want to give back, and that would be a great way, I think, for cities to get some of that talent to help them do things. The other thing that would be that I'm not sure if there is a good connection between what corporates are doing and the way cities operate. Corporates tend to work, on a very ROI-driven business case. Got to make it relatively fast so you can get the quicker turnaround, the quicker return on investment. I'm not sure if cities have that same kind of DNA, because a lot of city services are not necessarily meant to be for profit, right? They're meant to be providing citizens with services, and that's kind of to some extent why we pay taxes, is so that those services can be provided. They don't necessarily have to be generating a profit, but also means you don't necessarily have to do them as quickly as you would in the corporate world. So, I wonder if there's lessons to be learned for the cities on, can you go a little bit faster than what they're doing now, or do you need to go slowly in the way that most bureaucracies work in order to get the citizens to come along? I'm not sure what the right answer to that is.
Yeah, that's a great point. So the public sector people are not trained to be, business people. They're executor of what's mandated. So monetization is not really their forte. They're actually weak.
Yeah, I was just thinking, Paul, because there's other key KPIs that we use in the software world to measure the success of digital products, and one of them is adoption.
Absolutely.
And perhaps this idea of adoption and consumption could be something that cities might learn from. So for example, if you launch a digital product or a digital service in the software world, the first thing you're measuring is the adoption of your service very closely on a daily, if not hourly basis, especially if you're running a subscription-based type of service. So I think also having this mindset of not just launching digital services into the population, but then having the mindset of very closely monitoring adoption can give you a lot of good feedback on whether or not citizens are really using the technology in the way that you had hoped. So maybe if it's not an obsession over revenue, it could also be that kind of software companies are absolutely obsessed with adoption.
I see.
Yeah, for sure. And another area that is software, and this maybe is an area where maybe Japan can learn from other parts of the world sometimes. Having just come back to Japan, I noticed a lot of processes in Japan and procedures are extremely complicated. If there's a way that what we say in English, the KISS principle, keep it simple, stupid. To make the processes simple, to make the interfaces, the user interfaces on technology easy for people to use and to figure out, instead of having maybe lots of text, maybe just use emoticons, which kind of Japan invented emoticons for the original kind of the shell phones back in the 90s. The smiley faces and the happy faces and things like that. I actually had a project that I did in China a couple of years ago for actually a Japanese manufacturer of dental equipment, and we were helping them understand how can they lower the energy efficiency in their building using technologies. And one of the key things we discovered was, well, we need to make it think so people can see what's happening. So you create digital visualization. So we put a screen in the lobby, and we basically just used a happy face, a neutral face, and a sad face to communicate to the workers on the factory floor if the energy usage was up or down, and how they were doing on some of the environmental KPIs that they set. And we found that keep that really simple communication tool was really impactful for getting people to adopt and really take an interest in what they were trying to do. from the corporate perspective, it was like, oh my gosh, our energy bills have dropped by 20%. But the workers on the factory floor suddenly felt engaged and felt quite active in what they were doing, and you know, felt that, all right, yeah, we now work in a smart factory. This is really cool. So you know, keeping things simple and easy to communicate will help a lot with the adoption, I think, and making things, again, that this idea of people-centric.
But I think one of the most interesting recent examples of, or let's say benchmarking of digital transformation, was of course the management of the vaccine rollout across different countries. This was extremely fascinating to watch, right? Especially in a company like SAP, where you have colleagues across the globe. So you'll be dialing into a phone call and everyone will be comparing, how did you make an appointment? How did, oh, I had this mobile app. Oh, I have these papers in Minato. I got like coupons in the mail, and then I had to log in a website. My colleagues in Singapore just had a simple mobile app and did everything, you know, through. So I think the recent pandemic really highlighted as well, maybe some of the foundations of digital transformation, which is the data management and the processes behind it. Because if you don't have all the data centralized in one place with clear roles and responsibilities, then COVID really brought to light, when you try to launch quick services on top, it quickly becomes very complicated. But I would love to hear your perspective, Tak, on how you think Japan did in the pandemic. I mean, we were all getting vaccinated, which is a positive thing. That's the point at the end, right?
I don't think we are doing a great job on that. But you know, just looking back a little bit, so I think were over-adapted to an analog world. So sometimes people characterize it as the innovator's dilemma, right? Over-adaptation to you know, what's doing so well today and forget about the tomorrow. And you know, struggle from too well-crafted analog world to something different is a challenge we are facing today.
But I think that's a situation we see in many, many customers, right, who have very handcrafted business processes that they have honed and they have customized over years. And now you're bringing in a standard digital solution. And then I guess it comes back to Paul's point, which ends up being change management. And this must be something which happens within cities, right? So I don't really want that digital service because it's actually going to take away my job.
So probably what's missing was not the digital technology, rather the communication design.
Yes.
Right.
Non-digital portion of it actually was, you know, that's more important today.
Yeah, I think one thing that doesn't change as you shift from analog to digital is, you know, this idea of 99% of the world's problems are communication.
Right.
And it's that constant, you actually have to over communicate. What are the benefits? Why am I doing this? And it definitely, you know, if you look at in the world of management consulting and you do a big transformation project, usually the thing the clients don't want to pay for, there's two things they generally don't want to pay for. They don't want to pay for project management, and they don't want to pay for change management. And those are the two key things that will actually determine success.
Right.
How well have you planned out what you're going to do? And then how well are you communicating it? And are you over communicating it? And are you still over communicating it? And have you worked out what the different messaging is for the different stakeholders that you have in order to get them to adopt what you want them to do? And so it's, you know, at the end of the day, the technology is relatively easy to do. Technology does whatever you design it to do. If you don't get the people to come along, it's all for naught.
Yeah, it was interesting. I agree with you, Paul. I was reflecting again on the, you know, how we drive digital transformation in the corporate world. And for me, in a corporate boardroom or in a digital transformation conversation, there's always two very important advocates. One is the advocate for the employees, which is usually coming under your people organization of HR, who is extremely vocal about what impact this change is going to have on the workers, and, you know, how can we manage the upskilling and etc. And the other second extremely strong advocate you have is the advocate for the customer, right? Which will come, of course, primarily from your go-to-market and your services organization, but actually the company entirely. Everyone has the customer in the center. So you have this kind of people advocate and you have a customer advocate. But I'm wondering, in cities, do you have citizen advocates or citizen relations? Like, because in a boardroom, the customer is in the center and all the discussions are centering around this. But in a city, I've never heard of a role called like citizen advocate, citizen engagement, or citizen relations. I think it would be a great role to have in digital
It's a
transformation.
great point. So what I recently recognized that even the national government doesn't have the similar constitute,
Right.
the chief digital officer, chief risk officer.
Yeah,
those are
right.
missing in Japanese government setting.
Right. Yeah.
So the functional setting of the boardroom equivalent in public sector must be introduced sooner or later. Otherwise, the agility is always sacrificed.
Right.
So I wouldn't say, the city council don't look at the citizens. They care about citizens, but there's no organizational setting to make it a systematic, management of it.
Right.
So how can we transfer the lesson learned in the corporate world to public sector? What's the best way? If you look at the universities, they, for decades, disclose what they teach through the openware, systems, right?
Right.
Started from the MIT in Boston. Then most of the universities now disclose how they teach, the teaching materials and the video clips and everything for free of charge. Of course, they don't give credit to it, but still, materials are free of charge.
Right.
What's the best way from the corporate to the public sector? What do you think?
In terms of sharing our knowledge.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, one potential, is just to go and ask companies to participate. I think particularly in a place like there's not a long history of like corporate philanthropy in Japan. But there is a long history though of corporations being kind of the social fabric, being the social safety net of the country. I mean, I know when I came to Japan 30 years ago, it was very common for new grads to immediately move into the company dormitory, the concept of lifelong employment. And a lot of that, I think, culturally came about because a lot of social services that you'd see delivered in other countries by governments were actually being delivered by companies. And I think there, maybe there is still some of that latent, culture in Japan of maybe if cities went and asked the big corporates, would you please help us? There might be an openness to doing some of that because Japan Inc., as it were, is definitely aware of the demographic issues. They're definitely aware of kind of the hollowing out of Japan outside of like Tokyo, Osaka, the main 4 or 5 cities, and they have a vested interest in making sure that Japan remains a viable place. So maybe there's to kind of pull on some of those heartstrings almost, as it were, of these corporations, say, hey, come and help our cities, come and help where your grandparents used to live, and help us figure out how do we do this transition.
Yeah, the other thing I noticed, Paul, is that because digital transformation has really sort of taken off at such a rapid pace over the past decade, to your point, Tak, there's actually a lot of education available now for digital transformation leaders, not only from consulting organizations, but from a lot of educational institutions. So I also think that city leaders would benefit from taking a 1-week driving digital transformation. You can find these courses in almost now any university, including in Japan. And I think having the leaders go through it and just listening, I think there's so much that they could pick up from learning how businesses are driving this DX transformation. I would absolutely invest in that type of training for people. And the other thing is there's many freelance consultants for digital transformation available in the market. So even having someone come in and work with you for a week or a month, or just look at your plans and give you a second opinion, I think this is a skill set that the public sector could definitely try to tap into.
I see.
Yeah.
People at my age and above, so mid 50s to above,
35 and above.
raised up in the corporate world,
Yeah.
having excess capacity knowledge on ICT digital, but not having enough place to work in the company can serve for the purpose of public. So, veteran or seasoned, people who serve for the benefit of the cities, public space should be allowed to spend more time for the benefits of the smart cities, for example.
Yeah.
Which is a natural inclination slowly happening in Japan.
Yep, no, it definitely makes sense. And I think a lot of people would be keen to contribute that way.
Well, there's certainly a tremendous amount of knowledge, obviously, in the older generations, and in Japan, you're almost forced out of the workplace, the formal workplace in your early 60s. So there certainly would be an opportunity if cities are willing probably to have that talent come to them and transfer that as well.
Yeah, there were two more methodologies I was thinking about when I was preparing for this in terms of things which are commonly used within the IT industry around digital transformation. And one is, of course, the methodologies of Agile and Scrum development, which can then also be applied to projects. And I think for smart cities to adopt this kind of methodology, one of the keys is, of course, this kind of fail fast and learn approach. Nobody really knows what's going to stick sometimes when you're trying these things. So how do you get away from this traditional, very long drawn out waterfall planning with annual budgets and the way this is a shift that most corporations had to go through in their own IT planning, right? To work from a big upfront CapEx spending to now a consumption-based OpEx spending, much faster cycles, right? Is a change that we had to make in the corporate world that I think cities could also learn from. And the second one was design thinking, which most people are probably aware of, but this is the practice of trying to bring diverse viewpoints, purposely bring together diverse viewpoints in a room around a loosely defined problem to try to come up with new creative solutions. And I think probably like in companies, decision-making tends to be very siloed. So, we need a solution for employees, so we'll ask the HR department. We need finance, so we'll ask the finance department. Actually, some of the most creative solutions around digital transformation will come up from more diverse groups. So how could they also study and learn from the methodologies of Agile, Scrum, design thinking? I think these are all principles that can and should be applied into smart city development.
Good point.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you think that, if you take that almost a step further, where does all the data come from that is going to make a smart city possible and make these decisions possible? And that data is going to cut across all those silos that sit within a city or sit within a company even. And you have to think, using that design thinking analogy, Sinead, of, what is that flow of the data and where do the different data pools come from in order to get the big picture and understand where, what is actually happening? How do we drive the transformation? So it's really quite important to think, across the organization. You can't just think, as you said, just in the HR department or just in finance or whatnot. It's especially true as I think about, sustainability and how do we look at sustainability solutions and help organizations in the corporate world, like, reduce their carbon intensity. You have to cut across the entire organization, from the HR to production, supply chain, logistics, warehousing, and you have to look at things holistically. Otherwise, you're never going to capture what you need to capture. So I don't know. And typically, most cities have a huge issue of the silos within the organizations and people not sharing. So again, this maybe comes back to that, the change management aspects are so critical, and the communication aspects and getting people on board as to why they need to do this. And then in order to get those flows of information going through and everyone gathering that information, I think one of the big challenges initially in the early days of smart cities, and probably still even today, is why should I, as the sanitation department, why should I pay for this project if all the data I'm collecting is going to actually help the police department? And how do you get people to actually start sharing like that? Because that's what's required when you digitize things.
That's a great point too, Paul. So data ownership and the distinction between data users and the data originators, and then there is a structure in it so that collectively the system works, right?
Yeah.
And that's the kind of thinking is still missing in the public sector because of the silo mentality.
Yeah.
But also in the corporate world, SAP Japan spends quite a bit of time consulting its customers around the role of a COO. So I know the COO role is not so common in Japanese companies. We often say in SAP is one of the secrets to getting things done, right? So in a lot of European or American companies, you have a COO at a corporate level, but then that COO structure is also reflected within every single department. And the mandate of the operations team is to work across. So if you want to drive a digital transformation or a change into an organization and you don't have this kind of backbone across, you only have the silos, it becomes extremely difficult. When I was the COO of R&D, in reflection, I could have made a lot of decisions and made all sorts of budget plans and transformations, but if I hadn't had the network of COOs within each of the units, nothing actually would have been implemented. Right? So I don't know if there's COOs within the city setup, but who's responsible for wholly making this successful across everybody, right?
It's a great question. Once I was making benchmarks against the European banks, right, when I was back in the bank, and one of the banks in Europe had a very interesting organization setting.
Right.
In that bank, CEO has the final say to any business project. Right? Business was named as a king of everything because there are many money makers.
Right.
But in the usual case, COO just follows what business decided. But in that particular bank, it was opposite. Unless the CEO agrees, business cannot do anything because of the horizontal reasons.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
Amongst the few people that actually see everything that's going on.
Yeah, exactly. So what's happening, I think, is somewhat counterintuitive because horizontal prevails rather than vertical.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely.
Probably it's going to be interesting to have cross-sectoral conversations between public and private sectors to exchange views on it. So I think, for both sides, there are findings, right? Lesson learned. And they find room for collaboration, right? So maybe from the business standpoint, it will be source of business. From the public standpoint, it's a room for improvement, chance for improvement, right? And the distinction between the two, if it's too apart from each other, there is no synergies at all. But now, for the sake of the smart city, I think there's a reason why you can do it.
Right. Yeah, and I'm sure that a lot of corporations are quite interested in the opportunity of data and applications around citizens. Right? There's also a big business aspect to smart cities and having a platform by which the private sector can more easily offer services to citizens within cities. Right. You see the rise of independent mapping applications and payment applications. Japan has no shortage of mobile payment applications. When I arrived, I by accident installed too many, and then I couldn't figure out which one I was supposed to use for what. Right. So I think there's a lot of win-wins as well for using the private sector and their desire to also like I said, drive adoption of their digital services to also push forward the digitization of cities.
Another thing that's interesting when we talk about data and the digitization is, the data privacy issues that come up, and how do we deal with those, in the corporate world, this whole idea of customer data clouds and whatnot, and how do you keep that information secure? How do you collect customers' data and then make sure that they've opted into letting you use it, or give them visibility if they want to opt out. And I don't know if cities have thought through that aspects, and how, as citizens opt in to give their data to a certain part of the government, do they have the ability to opt out at some point? Can you get your data out of the government if you wanted to? I don't know, but that's definitely a key component of in the world of business that we deal with all the time now, particularly from regulations like GPRD in Germany and whatnot, that require companies to track all this data, but you also have to give customers the ability to like untrack them. I want to get out of your database, let me out. I don't know if you can do that with the government or not, but that might be another, because there's also a lot of talk in Japan about the people not trusting the government to give their data over. So is there a mechanism that we can learn from how data privacy laws work in commerce, and applying that to cities and making people more comfortable in allowing the digitization, these digital environments to start creating at the city level? Obviously, it didn't work out too well for Alphabet in Toronto, because people freaked out about their data going to Google, and it was not clear to them, how do I get my data back? And I think that's something that cities maybe need to think about and can learn from corporation, the corporate world, of how we're dealing with that now, and providing auditable, when did persons give us authorization to use that data? Did they come back in and say that they didn't want it? And then, through the digital platforms, we're able to then provide digital records of yes, they gave it to us, and then they want it out, so we've let them out. And they can actually ask to see that data anytime as a customer. And that's definitely probably something that companies, or that rather governments, need to understand more about, how companies are dealing with this, as a way to get citizens more comfortable to provide their data.
I think as we were talking, Tack, just in the lead up to this, I was saying that the tech industry is now at a very interesting ethical crossroads, where over the past 20 years or so, we put a lot of technology out into the world, but there hasn't been a lot of thought about how that technology will actually impact society, right? And we saw a lot of examples over recent years, right, of where technology has actually had quite a negative effect, or a negative impact. And I think that's something that cities can learn from, and not repeat that mistake, where you need leaders who think about building trust and privacy and ethics and the good of humanity into the solution from the beginning. It's not something that you do retroactively because someone slapped a fine on you, or because your customers start to scream. But I think we're starting to get to that stage in technology where we all understand that that's something that needs to be inherently built in. Like with SAP being a European company, that was always something that was extremely core to their values. And I see that coming out more and more. And also, as we're hiring people in the tech industry, people are more and more interested to be part of organizations that want to have that fundamental base of ethics and doing good for society. I think that's something where cities should take a lesson and maybe not repeat some of the mistakes we've made in big tech.
It's a great point. You know what? So it is evidenced in the data that the Japanese citizens are not trusting government. But my interpretation is that it's not that they don't trust the government. They want to trust the government, but don't know how to do it. Right. So, if the transparency, traceability, trust anchor, those are, articulate at the front, probably we have more reasons to convince the citizens to say, hey, this is how we maintain the trust in the society, right? So you can trust us. Of course, you
Right.
have a free to choose between opt-in, opt-out. Your data is yours. And then,
Right.
we will provide you this service in return to the data you provide. So there's a, feedback loop, all loop connected, right? So
Yeah.
now I think we are at the design stage. And then what's missing, the historically weakness of the our system is the communication again.
Communication,
Yeah.
I was just thinking corporations, I mean, obviously, as a public traded company, SAP has the obligation and the how would I say, the privilege of publishing a report for our shareholders every year, where we can share what we do. And of course, privacy, trust, and all of these are communicated on a regular basis. Cities obviously don't have that opportunity to produce such communications, and finding then what is the right channel to open up that conversation with your constituents.
Yeah, it's a great point. So the corporations are governed under the corporate governance code.
Yeah.
The accounting plays a very big role, right?
Of course.
When it comes to smart cities, there is no such things like a social accounting, social disclosure, right? So that's something we have to invent right now. Otherwise, society is fragmented.
Right.
Corporations are just working under the corporate regime. The public sectors are under just corporate, I don't know, governance code. And then there's no overarching, governance mechanism.
Yeah. I mean, I think the city leaders could learn maybe from, like, I remember SAP decided to start reporting sustainability metrics and introduced an integrated report, actually way back in the early 2000s, and that was a voluntary. So maybe cities could voluntarily publish more formally what they do, even if there isn't the regulations to require them to do so. What we saw with integrated reporting was that it then became a competitive advantage and something that built trust with your shareholders, and everyone then started to do it. And then by the time some of these things are now being regulated, the practice has already become quite common.
Yeah, right.
So maybe Japan could lead the way in city integrated reporting. I would love to know, the sort of economic metrics of the city that I'm living in, as well as the environmental metrics, right? And then what you can do as a citizen. I think a lot of young people would be interested in that information as well.
Right, and some cities disclose, KPIs, but without reasonable framework. So, if you have a bunch of KPIs without framework, it's a little confusing, right?
Confusing.
Yeah.
So just like the case of the integrated reporting or ESG, you might want to have some framework that automatically transcend the message to the readers. Within that framework, you populate the KPIs to actually report what it is, right? The progress.
Yeah.
And I think
if I was a young person trying to decide where to live, you might be looking at things like how easy it is for raising children, supporting women to work, or you'd be interested, I think young people would be interested in knowing about carbon footprint and what the city is doing to be environmentally friendly. And then of course, digital transformation and what digital services can be offered. I think having that kind of common communication could attract a lot of young people to cities. They could use it as a branding.
Yeah,
right. So Sinead and Paul, Smart City Institute is now introducing well-being and livability indicators, city indicators. Today we have no time to discuss about it in depth, but maybe offline or something else.
That would be great.
We can discuss the framework and work together.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that it's a framework for the well-being?
It's the framework that includes well-being as impact.
Okay.
Right, and livability as output.
Right.
Under which we have a project KPIs dedicated to smart city building.
Well, livability is definitely, in my book, one of the key reasons why you would do a smart city. But I think a lot of that, sometimes it gets lost by the technology vendors trying to pitch their stuff.
But I remember, like, when I was a young working mother with 2 small children, I lived in a suburb outside of Paris, Everything was digitized. The city had total view on my children, the services, what I needed. They knew where my children were registered. And then they offered me sports and after school classes that were close to the school. They automatically matched for me. And then they offered a transportation service to move the kids from the school to the registered sports. And it was all managed on one platform. This made my life as a working mother like really much easier, right? So these kind of solutions where you build that, like you said, you build that well-being and that livability in. This is when the digital transformation can have a real impact on people's lives. It was the best place to live as a young working mother. From 7 to 7, they would watch my children for me.
Wow. And what were the apps? Sinead, the apps were all like on a smartphone, or were they on a?
The kids at the time had a plastic card and they would use to tap in and tap out. And then all the data was collected by the city. And then of course they had a website that we could use to administer everything.
Right, right.
Yeah.
It's a perfect example. So even
very people-centric.
Right. Even if we collect the data and digitize the society, unless the society becomes kind to people, it doesn't make any sense.
Right. Exactly. And it doesn't help me to have a digital platform for the school if it doesn't talk to the platform where the kids are registering for their after school. And it was like by connecting the two and providing a holistic service with thinking about working parents in the center, that's what created this great experience for my kids and for me as a working parent.
I wonder how if they did like a design thinking workshop to come up with that.
Yeah, I mean, in Paris, it's very, very common to see in the morning working couples leaving the house. They're both dressed for work and they have 3, 4, 5 children. So it's possible, right? The cities are set up so it's possible for both parents to work full time and still have a lot of children. And yeah, it's one of the benefits to working in France.
All right, I think
that and the food.
Yeah, that and the food.
You know, we need glass of beer to talk more. Probably it's the right time.
That's right. Yeah, it's around time of the evening for a glass of wine.
I think
right?
so.
Okay, Sinead and Paul, thank you very much for collaboration.
Thank you very much,
Jack. Conversation today, and hopefully once the COVID-19 is clear, we can meet face to face.
Yes, that would be wonderful.
Over the coffee or over the wine or whatever, we can discuss more fun time.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much.
Look forward to it.
Okay, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Tak. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Fudo-san, let's conclude with your update.
Yep. So first of all, Sinead and Paul, thank you very much. And, this was our first time, in English version to have this very conversational webinar. So I would like to welcome today's viewers for, what you felt about today's webinar. So we welcome your candid opinion. And also, we'd like to say thank you for viewing today. And I just like to say that, programs of the webinars like today will be available on Smart City Institute's Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn, all those SNSs. And also they are posted on our website as well. And including today's webinar, the videos can be viewed on Smart City Institute Japan YouTube channel. And today we have this, parallels between enterprise DX and smart cities. And for next week, we have 2 more English-only series. One is from Barcelona, Spain, a new public transport era leveraging Galileo. And this will introduce the European project of the smart cities. And Tuesday, we welcome the guest speakers from WeGo in Korea. And last year we had this session, and this year they will come back again to speak about the update on the smart cities in Korea. And in the middle of August, we will have a digital government in Estonia and more to come. And about Smart City Institute, this was founded back in 2019 October. And now we have over 430 membership, and it's still growing. And also we have, I think, if my total is correct, we have now 35 advisors now. And also our global partner organizations who are promoting smart cities are increasing as well. Here we don't put private companies, but here we see NPOs and also the government related entities as well. So again, thank you for viewing today, and thank you, Sinead and Paul, for the splendid webinar. And thank you very much for viewing today. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.